Istvan Valley came out with a document called Monitoring Athlete Growth, and we know that there are physiological differences between girls and boys, and has been talked about earlier that girls will certainly change physically before boys, and yet we often assume that because someone is of a different stature, that their mental, emotional, and psychological development is tracking their body size. And that's a big boo-boo. We have to understand that simply because a child might be physically more advanced, that their mental, emotional, and psychological development does not necessarily track them, and we do a disservice to those children. Similarly, we can look at that in the opposite. The child that is a late bloomer, so to speak, the one that is a little bit late to get started. These windows that are shown here for females on the top and for males, again, just to let you know that we've been taking a fair beating. I think Istvan still has many bruises to show for it. But when we have put down these windows, which now, again, we no longer call windows of opportunity, what we call sensitive periods, sensitive to training, such that suppleness, differences in speed, stamina, strength, and so on can be positioned around peak height velocity. Much of what we talk about are guidelines, and we've talked about that already. In fact, the question which keeps coming back is, should girls be playing with boys? It's not a black and white answer, not black and white. And part of it is about being able to sit in rooms, learn, and then when you are there in that moment with that girl wanting to play on a boys' team, that you will know how to progress and how to navigate that special situation on her behalf. So being able to create training programs which are developmentally appropriate, not asking too much, but asking enough in which they can train, get a good stimulus, have fun with it, that meet not only their physical demands, but also that are mentally engaging and emotionally appropriate, which is very important as we've been hearing about girls. This is just one slide that I really like because it really focuses on physical literacy on those early stages from birth until 11 or 12 years of age. And as you can see, it's very intentional that once this foundation is set, the child can then progress up to the remainder of the long-term athlete development program or simply pursue activity for life, for health and well-being. But there's also an important arrow showing here that after they have finished their elite journey, wherever that might be, is that you haven't destroyed them along the way, they can come back to the active for life pathway. So this is the functional definition of physical literacy. And parents, we find, recreation programmers are getting a much better understanding about how we are trying to move physical literacy forward. So the first part is around the environments. You can see 5 different environments here: air, water, ground, ice, snow, and the outdoors. These are the 5 environments that we are promoting that all children be exposed to. And then we have the package of fundamental movement skills, starting with stability. Each of these boxes, they're not exhaustive, but the words that you will see contained will give you enough of information, give you a sense of what I mean by these basic fundamental movement skills. Stability with balance, stretching, twisting. Those are the ones that our little infants will first explore when learning to move from crawling to walking. Up into locomotion, where the body is starting to move from A to B, with the finishing of object manipulation skills that are sending and receiving. There are no sports in here. This is about acquiring physical literacy, which I say that at the risk of being in a room that is dedicated to ice hockey, and when we talk about this in Canada, you can imagine that it can be equally voracious. No sport under the age of 12. And we're not suggesting for a minute that kids do not play sports, but not at the expense of developing physical literacy. We make jokes in Canada. Can our ice hockey players swim? God help them if the ice rink melts. They might drown in an inch of water. Joking, but possibly true. Yes, there are very few sports which are permitted early specialization, but the vast majority have no business being early specializers. And I know that creates sand in a lot of people's shorts as you sit there thinking, geez, what are we supposed to do with that one? And so what do we need to do with that? And part of this is that we are deliberately, where sports are trying to implement their long-term athlete development program, if their programming involves children 12 years of age and under, trying to get sports to work together to promote and develop and support physical literacy. Real frickin' tall order, I tell you. And there's not many rooms that we can stand in and finish our messaging around that. Why is it important? Why is it important? You know, physical literacy isn't anything new. I mean, those of us that are old enough in the room probably remember coming out of the UK, movement education. I mean, it's repackaging of what we used to do quite naturally. But now, because of many, many changes within our culture and our society, we now have to restructure it back in. So why is it important? Because if you can imagine, and I say this to parents, by the age of 6, your child should have experienced all of those environments and all of those fundamental movement skills. Get them out there, doing it by the age of 6. And this then is going to enable that child to read the environment, anticipate what is happening, and then respond appropriately about making good decisions. Many of our children might become very, very good in one domain, but then they become quite geeky and awkward, and an accident waiting to happen in another dimension or another environment. We see this happen. Other parameters around physical literacy, which are more difficult to measure, movement with poise, economy, and confidence. And going back to where I started this talk is that we have a problem. We have a problem with our children that do not know how to fail. We have overprotective parents that failure is not an option. In fact, anything less than being the best is unacceptable. And we hear other anecdotal stories coming out around children being afraid to say no because of all of the money that's being pumped in to support their young athletic career, and they're only 11 or 12. There is no such thing as a 10-year-old champion. There's no such thing as a 12-year-old champion. There might be champion programs, but this illusion is such a struggle that we need to get over. An analogy that works with many is that physical literacy is really nothing different than learning your ABCs. When we teach our children reading and writing, don't we give them all 26 letters? We don't just give them A to M and say, go ahead, now do your best on reading and writing. Same thing with progression in schools. We don't ask our grade 1 children to be performing grade 7 mathematics. And yet in sport, where do we get off demanding that of our children and insisting that they do it as if they are much older and much more competent? Shame on us for allowing that to happen. And in particular in a place like sport, where we have the richest of opportunities to allow children to experiment, explore, take risks, fall down, pick themselves up, dust their knees off, and try it again, right away, all in 30 seconds. You can't say that about math class. Tests, you usually have to at least wait for 24 hours before you write one and get the exam result back. Sport has rich opportunities, and I hold out to sport that you also hold an iconic status in this culture. Where else, what other event in North America do people, well, I can relate to the 2010 games in Vancouver, where a nation riding the local transit will spontaneously start to sing a national anthem? That was because of 2010 Olympics. That's what sport did for Vancouver and for the country. I can't say that yes, there's beautiful musical performances and dance performances, but I can't recall any time people would stand up and sing the national anthem on behalf of them.
I am Yelena Simbaeva, and this is my story. Since when I was kids, I dreamed to be the great Olympic champion in gymnastics. But that's very difficult for me because I was so tall. Now gymnastics is finished for me. My coach asked me, do you want to try pole vault? I say, what? What is it, please? When I start to do pole vault, they say, okay, in future you will jump 5 meters. First I say, are you crazy? I improve myself every year. Now I have 19 world records. Where you start isn't necessarily where you end up.
Isn't that novel? Actually, a coach making a recommendation for an athlete to change sports. I think we need to have many more of those conversations. And again, coming back to the female athlete, thanks to Canadian Sport for Life and them inviting me around their table, which has made inroads beyond anybody's imagination. And again, all of these articles will be available around how I have been trying to develop a story, evidence-based, and a messaging that makes it more possible and more manageable for people to build excellent female athletes from the physical literacy years up. When we think about building training programs, really there are very little differences that we would note between men's programs and women's programs. Every single performance is going to require contributions from the physical, technical, tactical, and mental side of it. Obviously differences based on the sport discipline. There's some wonderful information also coming out around sleep, rest, and recovery, and sport nutrition we're constantly being bombarded with as well. But when we start to imagine what are some of the differences that female athletes need, as what we've heard again earlier, is that it has not always been possible for women to participate in sport as freely as they can nowadays. And yet there are still obstacles to women competing. And based on that, a lot of the evidence that we have has been generated from findings and experiments performed in men. And there was nothing wrong with that. That's what we learned from our training programs. But it wasn't always that way. And in fact, there still seems to be some impediments around moving our understanding about female athlete adaptations to exercise and training. So this is, again, my attempt to poke at fun about where we've come from.
The female body. Amazing in its own way. Not as strong or as fast as the male body, but it still works for cooking, cleaning, and collecting firewood. The female's brain is about the same size as the male brain, but it is not equipped with the math skills needed to beat world records or keep score, which is why women use calculators. From a psychological view, the female mind is conditioned from an early age to know her place. A lack of female athletes and coaches helps reinforce this conditioning. Their weak minds match their weak bodies, so more sports scholarships are given to boys. Women are ruled by hormones, which is why they sometimes gather and try to play games. And although they have the same sweat glands as their male counterparts, their glands should never actually produce sweat. The female body is built to have babies, lots and lots of babies. So every month, girls experience their menstrual cycle. At this time, they must be kept inside, lest they attract bears. Giving girls their own playing fields is potentially deadly and should be avoided. Even riding a bike might cause feminine damage. For her own protection, she should walk, but never alone or at night. So as you can see, the female body is most efficient at rest. Any rigorous physical activity might cause breakage, internal bleeding, or long bouts of crying, which is why women should never play sports. That's biology, folks. There's nothing we can do about it.
Beat the inequality, stereotypes, unfair pay, myth, mistreatment, absurdity, stupidity, beat the BS.
So actually every piece of information that was in there was at one point actually counted on. Some of it around damage to reproductive organs. It's been written about in medical literature. So it is actually yes, and I'm glad to hear most of us laugh about it and not take this home and think, oh my goodness, women should not be.